You think you're so clever, walking around judging everyone else's toxicity, while you're drowning in your own unconscious patterns. You believe you can spot manipulators and energy vampires from across the room, but you can't even see the one living in your mirror. You're so busy protecting yourself from obvious villains that you've invited the subtle ones to live in your head, rent-free. If this message found you today, it's because your energy field is screaming for help. The universe doesn't send random warnings. Right now, someone is feeding on your sanity, and you're calling it love. Someone is projecting their chaos onto you, and you're calling it empathy. Someone is draining your life force, and you're calling it friendship. You're not as aware as you think. You're not as protected as you believe. If this resonates with you, consider liking and subscribing. You're going to need what comes next. You think you're so smart, don't you? You believe you can spot toxic people from a mile away. You watch for the obvious red flags, the dramatic outbursts, the clear manipulators. But while you're busy congratulating yourself on avoiding the obvious villains, there are people right now, maybe even at your dinner table, who are slowly poisoning your mind. And you don't even know it's happening. If you're hearing this message right now, it's because something in your energy field pulled this knowledge toward you. The universe doesn't deliver random messages. You needed to hear this today. Here's what you're getting wrong. You think dangerous people announce themselves. You think they come with warning labels. You assume emotional vampires look like monsters. But the truth is, the most destructive people in your life probably seem normal, even charming. They might be your partner, your parent, your best friend. And while you're looking for obvious evil, they're quietly feeding on your sanity. You make this mistake because you trust your surface-level judgment. You see someone being nice and think they're safe. You see someone struggling and think they need your help. You see someone successful and think they have it together. But you're looking at masks, not faces. You're seeing performances, not people. If you genuinely enjoy this kind of content, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Let me paint you a picture of how blind you really are. There's someone in your life right now who makes you feel constantly guilty. Every conversation leaves you questioning yourself. Were you too harsh? Did you say something wrong? Should you have done more? You walk away from them feeling drained, confused, like you're the problem, and you are so wrapped up in trying to fix yourself that you never stop to ask why this only happens with them. You call it empathy. You tell yourself you're being understanding. You pride yourself on being the bigger person. But what if I told you that you're not being empathic? You're being harvested. Your emotional energy is being systematically extracted by someone who doesn't even realize they're doing it. This is the unconscious manipulator, and they're everywhere. You see them at work. They're the colleague who somehow makes every project about their personal struggles. You see them in relationships. They're the partner who turns every disagreement into a referendum on whether you really care about them. You see them in families. They're the relative who has a crisis every time you try to set a boundary. But here's what makes them truly dangerous. They genuinely don't know they're doing it. In their mind, they're the victim. Always. Forever. Without exception. Let me tell you how they operate, and pay attention because you've fallen for this 1,000 times. They project their inner chaos onto you like you're a blank screen. When they feel angry, suddenly you're the aggressive one. When they feel guilty, somehow you're the one who should apologize. When they feel inadequate, miraculously you're the one who's being superior and judgmental. You think you're having a normal conversation, but you're not. You're in a hall of mirrors where everything is backwards. Their guilt becomes your responsibility. Their anger becomes your fault. Their disappointment becomes your failure. And the sickest part is that you start believing it. You start thinking maybe you really are too sensitive. Maybe you really are selfish. Maybe you really are difficult. You begin policing your own thoughts, editing your words, shrinking yourself to avoid triggering them. But here's the truth that will sting. No matter how small you make yourself, it's never enough, because the problem was never you. The problem is the volcanic mess inside them that they refuse to face. These people live with a basement full of emotional toxic waste, unprocessed trauma, unintegrated shadows, unheard pain. But instead of cleaning their own house, they dump it in yours. Day after day, conversation after conversation, they hand you their emotional garbage and expect you to sort it out. You want to know why this pattern keeps happening to you. You want to know why you keep attracting these people. Here's the uncomfortable truth. They can smell your need to be needed. They can sense your addiction to fixing broken people. They know, on an unconscious level, that you'll take responsibility for feelings that aren't yours. Look at your life right now. How many conversations do you have where you're managing someone else's emotions? How many relationships revolve around you being the stable one, the understanding one, the one who never gets to have a bad day? How many times have you apologized for things you didn't do just to keep the peace? You're not keeping peace. You're enabling emotional terrorism. What makes this worse is that unconscious manipulators often come wrapped in beautiful packages. They're sensitive, they're deep, they're artistic, they have fascinating stories and intense emotions. They make you feel special at first, like you're the only one who truly understands them. But that specialness is a trap, because once you're hooked on being their savior, you're trapped in their psychodrama forever. They'll tell you about their difficult childhood, and you'll feel compassion. They'll share their fears and insecurities, and you'll want to protect them. They'll show you their wounds, and you'll want to heal them. But those wounds are bottomless pits. You could pour your entire life into them, and they'd still be empty, because the healing they need can only come from within, and they have no intention of doing that work. Share in the comments right now which relationships in your life drain you the most. Don't name names, but describe the feeling. Does it match what I'm describing? But unconscious manipulators are just the first layer of this psychological hell. There's another type that's even more insidious because they hide behind something everyone respects. Success, achievement, social acceptance. They've mastered the art of looking perfect while being completely empty inside. This is the bearer of the persona, the one who sold their soul for a good reputation. You know these people. They're the ones with the perfect Instagram life, the flawless career, the ideal family photos. Everything about them is curated, polished, rehearsed. They never have a hair out of place or an emotion out of control. They're so put together that being around them makes you feel like a mess. But here's what you don't see. Behind that perfect mask is a person in psychological agony. They're so disconnected from their true self that they don't even remember who they really are anymore. They've been performing for so long that the performance has become their prison. You think their criticism of you is about your flaws. You think when they judge your choices, or your lifestyle, or your emotions, it's because you're doing something wrong. But their judgment has nothing to do with you. They attack your authenticity because it reminds them of everything they've murdered in themselves. When you laugh too loud, it reminds them they've forgotten how to feel joy. When you cry openly, it reminds them they've buried their pain so deep they can't access it anymore. When you take risks, or make mistakes, or show vulnerability, it reminds them of the life they're too terrified to live. These people will slowly poison your authenticity, not through dramatic attacks but through subtle disapproval, a raised eyebrow when you express emotion, a little comment about being more professional, a suggestion that you're being too much, too emotional, too honest, too real. They make you question whether being yourself is acceptable. They make you wonder if you should be more controlled, more appropriate, more like them. And slowly, without realizing it, you start putting on a mask too. You start editing yourself. You start performing instead of living. The bearer of the persona doesn't want to destroy you. They want to recruit you. They want you to join them in their prison of perfection because your authenticity makes them feel the bars of their cage. But there's something even more dangerous than people who hide behind masks. There are people who've buried parts of themselves so deep that those parts have turned into psychological bombs. And when those bombs go off, you're the one who gets hit by the shrapnel. This is the owner of the repressed shadow, the person who's convinced themselves they're pure light while their darkness festers underground. You think you know what repression looks like. You imagine someone uptight, rigid, obviously struggling, but you're wrong again. The most repressed people often look the most controlled. They're the ones who never lose their temper, until they do. They're the ones who never show weakness, until they break. They're the ones who judge everyone else's flaws while being blind to the monster growing inside them. Here's how you fall for their trap every single time. You see someone who seems to have it all together. They're disciplined, they're moral, they're responsible. You think finally someone's stable, someone mature, someone safe. But that stability is an illusion built on a foundation of denied rage, suppressed desires, and rejected humanity. You want to know why your relationships explode out of nowhere. You want to know why people you trusted suddenly turn vicious. It's because you mistake repression for strength. You see someone white-knuckling their way through life and think they're in control, but they're not in control. They're in denial. These people live their entire lives trying to be what they think is good. They push down their anger and call it patience. They suppress their needs and call it selflessness. They murder their desires and call it virtue. But everything they reject doesn't disappear. It goes underground and rots, and then you come along. You, with your emotions and your needs and your humanity. You, who reminds them of everything they've forbidden themselves to feel. You become the screen where they project all their repressed darkness. Suddenly you're the angry one. You're the selfish one. You're the one with all the problems they refuse to see in themselves. You've experienced this, haven't you? Someone who seemed so together, suddenly exploding at you over nothing. Someone who preached about morality, suddenly doing something shockingly cruel. Someone who claimed to be above petty emotions, suddenly drowning in jealousy or rage. And somehow, they made it your fault. You triggered them. You pushed them. You made them act that way. But here's what really happened. Their shadow finally broke through their defenses, and you were just the nearest target. You became the scapegoat for decades of denied feelings. You got punished for their lifetime of self-rejection. The owner of the repressed shadow doesn't just hurt you with their explosions. They hurt you with their constant judgment. They're always watching, always evaluating, always finding you lacking. They criticize your emotions because they've killed their own. They judge your mistakes because they can't admit their own. They attack your humanity because they've rejected theirs. You try to please them. You try to meet their impossible standards. You walk on eggshells, choosing every word carefully, managing your behavior to avoid their disapproval. But it's never enough, because what really bothers them isn't what you do. It's what you are, a human being who hasn't murdered their own soul. These people create an atmosphere of suffocation. Being around them feels like being in a pressure cooker. Everyone's tense, everyone's careful, everyone's performing the same repression dance, pushing down their real feelings to maintain the illusion of peace. But it's not peace. It's a battlefield where everyone's fighting their own nature. You know what's really sick about this. The more you try to be good enough for them, the more you repress yourself. You start adopting their poison. You begin judging your own emotions, suppressing your own needs, questioning your own humanity. You become infected with their shadow denial, turning into another repressed soul, creating more shadows. But wait, it gets worse. Because some people don't just repress their shadows. They turn their repression into a weapon. They use morality like a club to beat you into submission. This is the moral controller, the one who's appointed themselves as your spiritual police. You think you can recognize a controlling person. You look for obvious dominance, clear aggression, visible force. But you're missing the most insidious form of control, the kind that comes wrapped in concern for your well-being, advice for your own good, and criticism disguised as caring. The moral controller has figured out the ultimate manipulation. They don't control your body. They control your conscience. They get inside your head and install a critical voice that sounds just like them. Long after they're gone, you're still hearing their judgments, still measuring yourself against their standards, still feeling guilty for being human. You fall for this because you mistake their rigidity for wisdom. You see someone with strong principles and think they must know something you don't. You see someone who seems certain about right and wrong and assume they must be right. But their certainty doesn't come from wisdom. It comes from fear of their own shadows, their own desires, their own humanity. These people weaponize guilt like others, weaponize anger. They don't need to shout or threaten. They just need to look disappointed. They master the art of the sigh, the concerned look, the gentle suggestion that you're letting everyone down. They make you feel guilty for existing, for having needs, for being anything other than what they've decided you should be. You've been trained by these people, haven't you? Trained to feel guilty for saying no. Trained to feel selfish for having boundaries. Trained to feel wrong for trusting your own feelings. They've installed their voice in your head, and now you police yourself. You've become your own moral prison guard. The moral controller doesn't see you as a person. They see you as a project, something to be improved, corrected, saved. They're constantly evaluating your choices, your lifestyle, your beliefs. Nothing you do is ever quite right. There's always some way you're falling short of their moral standards. But here's the truth they'll never admit. Their obsession with your morality is really about their own corruption. They police your behavior because they can't face their own shadows. They judge your choices because they're terrified of their own desires. They try to save you because they can't save themselves. Every accusation they make is a confession. When they call you selfish, they're revealing their own hidden greed. When they call you weak, they're exposing their own fragility. When they call you immoral, they're telling you about the darkness they're desperately trying to deny. Tell me in the comments, who in your life makes you feel guilty for being human? Who installed that critical voice in your head? When did you start policing yourself? You want to be good. You want to be moral. You want to do the right thing. But the moral controller has twisted these noble desires into chains. They've turned your conscience into a torture device. They've made you afraid of your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own human nature. The moral controller creates a special kind of hell, a hell where you're always guilty, always falling short, always needing to be better. A hell where being human is a sin and having needs is selfish. A hell where you can never rest because you're constantly failing some impossible standard. But now, we come to the most unpredictable danger of all, the human emotional landmine. The person who can love you in the morning and destroy you by nightfall, and they themselves don't know why. This is the complexed individual, someone so controlled by their unconscious patterns that they're basically a passenger in their own life. You think emotional instability is obvious. You think you can spot someone who's volatile, inconsistent, unpredictable, but you're looking at the surface again. You're watching for mood swings when you should be watching for pattern triggers. You're looking for crazy when you should be looking for wounded. The complex person isn't choosing to be chaotic. They're being driven by psychological programs installed in childhood, trauma responses frozen in time, emotional loops they can't escape. They're not living in the present. They're constantly reliving the past through you. Here's how you get trapped every single time. They show you their best self first. The part that isn't triggered, isn't activated, isn't being run by their complexes. You fall in love with that person. You believe that's who they really are. And then the complexes activate, and suddenly you're dealing with a completely different human being. One day, they're confident and secure. The next day, a single word sends them spiraling into abandonment panic. One moment, they trust you completely. The next moment, they're convinced you're betraying them. You didn't change. They didn't change. But the complex took over, and now you're not dealing with them anymore. You're dealing with their wounded inner child, their traumatized teenager, their abandoned self. You try to navigate this minefield. You learn their triggers. You avoid certain topics. You manage your behavior to prevent their explosions. But it's impossible because the triggers aren't logical. They're not about what you do. They're about what you represent in their unconscious theater. Sometimes you're cast as the abandoning parent. Sometimes you're the betraying ex. Sometimes you're the critical authority figure. You never auditioned for these roles, but you're playing them anyway. And the complex person genuinely believes you are these things. In that moment, their complex has completely hijacked their reality. You want to help them. You see their pain and you want to heal it. You recognize their suffering and you want to ease it. But here's what you don't understand. You can't heal someone else's complexes. You can't love someone out of their trauma. You can't stability someone into wholeness. The more you try to help, the more entangled you become in their psychological web. You become part of the complex. Your presence triggers it. Your absence triggers it. Your love triggers it. Your boundaries trigger it. Everything triggers it because the complex isn't about you. It was formed before you existed, and it will continue after you're gone. Living with a complex person means living in constant emotional whiplash. The person who adores you becomes the person who despises you. The person who needs you becomes the person who pushes you away. The person who trusts you becomes the person who interrogates you. And each version believes they're completely justified. You start doubting your own reality. Were you really insensitive? Did you actually say that? Are you remembering correctly? The complex person's reality shifts so dramatically that you begin questioning your own perception. You start keeping records, saving texts, trying to prove to yourself that you're not crazy. But the real damage isn't the chaos. It's the intermittent reinforcement. Because between the episodes, they're wonderful. Between the triggers, they're everything you wanted. This creates a psychological addiction. You become hooked on the good moments, constantly chasing them, constantly hoping this time will be different. You make excuses for them. They had a hard childhood. They're working through things. They don't mean it. They can't help it. And all of that might be true. But it doesn't change the fact that you're being psychologically destroyed by someone else's unhealed wounds. The complex person will drain you in a unique way, not through conscious manipulation, but through the sheer exhaustion of never knowing which version of them you'll encounter. You're always on guard, always prepared, always watching for signs of which complex is about to take control. But there's one final type that makes all the others look manageable. Because while the others take your peace, your authenticity, your stability, this last one takes something even more fundamental. This is the psychic vampire, the one who feeds on your life force itself. You think vampires are obvious. You imagine someone clearly needy, obviously dependent, visibly draining. But you're wrong one last time. The most effective psychic vampires often appear strong, confident, even helpful. They don't look like they need anything, but they need everything. The psychic vampire has figured out how to outsource their entire emotional life to other people. They don't generate their own energy. They don't process their own feelings. They don't solve their own problems. They've learned to survive by feeding on others' emotional labor, attention, and life force. You know these people. They're the ones who always have a crisis that only you can solve. They're the ones who call at midnight with emergencies that aren't emergencies. They're the ones who need constant reassurance, constant attention, constant emotional management. But here's the trick. They've made you believe this is friendship. They've convinced you this is love. They've trained you to think this is what caring looks like. The psychic vampire doesn't just take your time. They take your capacity to feel. After dealing with their emotions all day, you have nothing left for your own. After solving their problems, you have no energy for yours. After managing their life, you can barely manage your own. You've been trained to see this as noble. You call it being supportive. You call it being there for someone. You call it being a good friend. But what you're really doing is allowing someone to use you as an emotional life support system while they refuse to develop their own emotional capabilities. The psychic vampire creates a special kind of dependency. They make you feel needed, important, special. You're the only one who understands them, the only one who can help them, the only one they trust. This feels like intimacy, but it's not. It's parasitism dressed up as love. You want to set boundaries, but they've trained you to feel guilty for having needs. You want to say no, but they've convinced you that's abandonment. You want to take space, but they've made you believe that's cruelty. They've hijacked your empathy and turned it into a feeding tube. Here's the most disturbing part. The psychic vampire often doesn't know they're doing it. They genuinely believe they're just sensitive, just struggling, just needing support. They've never learned to generate their own emotional energy, so they think this is how relationships work. They think love means someone else carrying their emotional weight forever. Living with a psychic vampire means slowly disappearing. Your interests fade because you have no energy for them. Your dreams die because you're too exhausted to pursue them. Your relationships wither because you have nothing left to give. You become a ghost of yourself, existing only to sustain someone else's life. All 6 of these types share one thing in common. They're not living consciously. They're being lived by their unconscious patterns, their shadows, their complexes, their unhealed wounds. And as long as you stay unconscious of these patterns, you'll keep falling into their traps. The solution isn't to isolate yourself. It's to wake up, to recognize these patterns, to understand that you've been participating in these dances. Because here's the final truth that will set you free. You can only be manipulated through your own unconscious patterns. You can only be drained through your own unhealed wounds. You can only be controlled through your own shadows. The work isn't just to avoid these people. The work is to become so conscious, so integrated, so whole that these patterns can't hook you anymore. When you've faced your own shadow, you can't be manipulated through projection. When you've integrated your own complexes, you can't be destabilized by others' chaos. When you've learned to generate your own energy, you can't be drained by vampires. This journey starts with brutal honesty. Which of these types are you? Because if you're human, you're at least one of them. We all have shadows. We all have complexes. We all have the capacity to unconsciously harm others while believing we're good people. The question isn't whether you have these patterns. The question is whether you'll face them or let them run your life from the shadows.